Part 1. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 of the main volume of the Ruyi Young Man. Hydrangeas dropped from the sky, take a look, take a look. Bayazai, freshly baked buns. Masters, don't stand outside, come in, and have fun. On the bustling streets, there are rows of shops and stalls lined both sides of the road. There are shouts and people coming and going, making it very lively. In a remote alley in the city, several beggars were leaning against the wall listlessly. The sun at noon is too strong, and those who sit outside begging will get their butts burned. They will wait until an hour later, when the weather gets cooler, to go out to beg. At the far end of the alley, there was a person lying across the street. It was a young man with a pale face and plain clothes. He had been lying there motionless for several hours. The beggars occasionally glanced into the alley and chatted casually. Tisk, tisk, I don't know who it is, but he is so cruel. Those people struck hard, but this scholar's body is too weak to resist the beating. He has been lying down for several hours. I don't know if he can survive. If he doesn't wake up tomorrow, he can't stay in this alley, lest he be discovered by the government and become someone else's scapegoat. The noisy sound coming from nowhere kept hitting Tang Ning's eardrums, making it difficult to hear the content clearly and making people upset. He wanted to block his ears, but found that he couldn't. His consciousness was extremely clear, but he couldn't control his body, even if he just moved his fingers or opened his eyes. The faint pain from various parts of his body made him become more awake, and some memories began to emerge clearly in his mind. 2 hours ago, he had just completed the defense of 2 graduation theses and successfully obtained a dual master's degree from a university in the Northwest. Before that, he had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights in order to revise the thesis. When he left school and rushed back to the orphanage where he grew up, he finally couldn't bear the fatigue and fell asleep on the bus. When you wake up, it's now. The environment outside was noisy, his body was sore, and he couldn't open his eyes. Could there have been a car accident while he was sleeping? Tang Ning could only think of this possibility. He was a little lucky, but also a little scared. Fortunately, he was still conscious, and at least his life was saved. What he was afraid of was that he would become a vegetative state. After the old dean left, he would have no relatives in this world. He didn't know what would happen to the hospital. How to deal with a vegetative person who cannot contact any family members or friends. He began to work hard to control his body and opened his eyes desperately. A small figure walked in from the alley. It was a little beggar. His clothes were tattered and patched, but not as filthy as other beggars. Under his messy hair, he had a pair of clear eyes. The little beggar walked to the deepest part of the alley, glanced at the figure lying on the ground, paused, walked around him, and squatted down in the corner next to him. Listening to the discussion of those beggars, the little beggar looked at the young man lying on the ground. The man's fingers moved, as if he was thirsty, and he licked his lips several times in a short period of time. The little beggar suddenly stood up and walked out of the alley. Tang Ning still couldn't control his body, and his eyelids were still heavy, but he was able to move his fingers and lick his dry lips. Suddenly there was the sound of slight footsteps, as if someone was approaching. The person stopped beside him, and not long after, cool liquid slipped into his throat. If Tang Ning's lips were like parched earth, then this hint of coolness was like the rain from a long drought. Tang Ning was surprised to find that he could control his body. He opened his eyes with difficulty and said in a hoarse voice, "Nurse, I." His voice stopped suddenly, because what he saw was not an angel in white wearing a nurse's uniform, but a dirty little face, about 11 or 12 years old, male or female, with messy hair. A pair of big eyes are bright and lively. The other party held a lotus leaf in his hand, folded it and made it into a container. There was water in the container, which should have been used to feed him just now. "This is not a hospital, and he is not lying on a hospital bed. He is lying in an alley, and not far away are several beggars in ragged clothes, leaning against the wall, looking at him with strange eyes. When the little beggar saw that he was awake, he silently retreated to the corner and stopped looking at him. Goo, goo goo. The first thing Tang Ning needed to figure out was not where he was or how he got here, but how he could fill his stomach. He was so hungry that he didn't even have the strength to stand up. The little beggar took out a paper bag from his arms and opened it. There was a cold bun inside. Goo, goo goo. Tang Ning stared at the bun. The little beggar put the bun to his mouth. Goo, goo goo. Tang Ning was still staring at the bun. The little beggar looked at him, with a look of hesitation on his dirty little face. After thinking for a while, he divided the bun into two halves and handed half over. Without hesitation, Tang Ning stuffed half of the bun into her mouth and swallowed it in big gulps. Stuffed with cabbage. The little beggar put the remaining half of the bun to his mouth, and heard the voice again, goo, goo goo. This time Tang Ning didn't look at the little beggar. The bun in the little beggar's hand had already been brought to his mouth, but he didn't bite it. After a while, the other half of the bun was handed over, but Tang Ning did not take it. The little beggar placed the half of the bun on the lotus leaf, stood up, and walked out of the alley. Tang Ning looked outside the alley, trying to memorize the figure in his mind. After a long while, he picked up the half-filled cabbage bun, stuffed it into his mouth, and swallowed it in big mouthfuls. The bun was big and full of stuffing. After eating one bun, he finally regained some strength. He reached into his pocket, ready to take out his phone. There was no pocket, let alone a phone. He lowered his head and finally realized something was wrong. His clothes, his shoes, his hands. He showed disbelief on his face, reached out to touch his face, looked around in confusion, and walked towards a puddle of rain not far away. On the surface of the water, an extremely unfamiliar face was reflected. Tang Ning stood at the entrance of the alley. 2 steps forward, there was a busy street. He looked confused, stretched out his hands, looked down, and still couldn't accept this reality. He couldn't accept his body, his appearance, and the world he lived in. He just took a nap on the bus. People were coming and going around him, all dressed in ancient costumes. He stepped out and walked around the street. He didn't see any cameras or anything like that, no trace of modern technology. Let him see a car, an air conditioner, or even a tricycle. No, nothing, not to mention a tricycle, not even a bicycle. If it weren't for his body, he might still have a glimmer of hope, but looking at his hands that were obviously smaller, the scratch on his left hand that was accidentally scratched a few days ago also disappeared without a trace. He graduated with a master's degree at the age of 23. Now this body looks like he is at most 16 or 17 years old. Both his appearance and body shape are very different from before. He has been interested in traditional Chinese culture since he was a child. During his master's degree, in addition to his major, he also obtained a master's degree in Chinese language and literature. In his spare time, he also read novels, traditional and online. He is very familiar with this situation. If this is not a dream, he may have traveled through time. Just yesterday, he had just finished reading a historical time travel novel called The Little Scholar of Carefree Life. The protagonist in the novel traveled through time after sleeping in a library, which was somewhat similar to his situation. The difference was that when the guy named Li Yi traveled through time, he had a library in his mind. With a vast amount of modern knowledge, he split the land and became a king in another world, and finally lived a shameless life with a group of wives and concubines. He had also read some other types of time travel novels. Others who traveled through time all had rings, systems, and libraries. Under the guidance of the old man with white beard, they embarked on a path of becoming a peerless strongman who defied the heavens. He had nothing. He didn't even know who he was or where he lived. He was a little sad that the time traveler had become like this, in addition to not being able to accept the reality of time travel. He walked in the street in a daze. It was fine if he didn't have a system or a cheat code, but at least he knew who he was, where his home was, what place he was in, and whether he could have cabbage buns for the next meal. Hungry and depressed, Tang Ning couldn't help but raise his head and raised his middle finger, cursing, "Damn God, why do you have to do this?" A black shadow quickly enlarged in front of his eyes. Bang! On a two-story building on the street, a pretty woman looked at the young man who fell down on the street and was stunned for a moment. She covered her face and murmured, "It's over, my hand slipped." Someone started to rush down from the attic. On the street, in the crowd, a young man looked at the figure lying on the ground and shouted, "Quick, hurry up and get the hydrangea back for me." Tang Ning lay on the ground, his head buzzing, and something wet flowed down his forehead. He was holding a big red ball in his arms, solid. He didn't dare to curse the thief god anymore. He was afraid that the next time it would not be a stone that fell from the sky, but a knife. He held the thing tightly in his arms. This was the murder weapon and the evidence. He was bleeding from the blow, so he had to pay some money, right? With the money, he would buy buns, 10 buns. He would also return a bun to the little beggar, no, 10 buns, 100 buns. There were chaotic footsteps around him, and those people were trying to snatch the evidence in his arms. Tang Ning curled up and held the thing tightly in his arms, clenching his teeth and refusing to let go. A bunch of bastards, they were in such a state, and they still wanted to take the murder weapon and destroy the evidence. Are they still human? Fists started to fall on him, and then feet. He was bullied a lot in an orphanage when he was a child, but he still held the murder weapon tightly. This was not a murder weapon, it was evidence, buns, 100 buns. Stop, stop quickly. A sharp voice sounded, and Tang Ning opened his eyes and saw several people wearing the clothes of officials in ancient costume dramas walking quickly towards him. This was the last scene he could see. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 2. It's been several hours, why haven't you woke up yet? Hey, how pitiful. Miss Tang originally wanted to hit the man named Dong, but she accidentally hit the wrong uncle who was passing by. Why were you passing by? I was upstairs and saw clearly that my uncle had fallen to the ground, and he was still holding the hydrangea tightly. He let those people punch and kick him and refused to let go. My uncle must like the young lady very much. He doesn't want the young lady to marry someone named Dong, and he doesn't want the young lady to jump into a pit of fire. That's why he did that. Of course, people who like young ladies in Lingzhou City can line up from here to the city gate. In Zhong Mansion, several maids and servants gathered in the courtyard, talking quietly, and occasionally glancing at a door somewhere. A little further away, a middle-aged man with a fair face stood in the corridor, looking at the beautiful woman beside him, and said angrily, "How can you make such a big decision about throwing hydrangeas to attract a bride?" The kingly woman smiled and said, "It's better to marry someone than to be pestered by someone all the time." "But you can't." The middle-aged man opened his mouth, but didn't say anything else. Finally, he sighed, "I'm sorry for you, Dad." The woman raised her face, smiled again, and said, "Dad, it's okay. My daughter is a married woman now. Governor Dong will not use this matter to embarrass you in the future. This marriage, I don't agree with it." A trace of firmness appeared on the middle-aged man's face, and he gritted his teeth and said, "Although Dad is not as good as Dong, he is still a county magistrate, and he gets a salary from the court. He doesn't dare to go too far." Before he finished speaking, a maid ran over and said in a panic, "Master, Miss, my uncle is awake, my uncle is awake." When Tang Ning opened her eyes, there was still a dull pain in her head and her consciousness was a little blurry. "It's over, it's time to sit and stand." He sat up from the bed suddenly. Boom. There was severe pain on his forehead again. He covered his forehead and looked at the woman in a green dress opposite, who also covered her forehead and glared at him, frozen in place. An antique room with a group of people in ancient costumes and clothes. It wasn't a dream. The little beggar who saved him, the bun stuffed with cabbage, and this strange ancient world, they were all not a dream. Where's my stuff? He seemed to remember something and began to look around. When he saw that the murder weapon was still held tightly in his arms, he breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the evidence was not lost. Only now did he have time to carefully look at the object that hit him. It was a ball-shaped object, wrapped in red silk on the outside, and solid on the inside. He squeezed it. It was very hard and heavy. It was probably a stone. Fortunately, there was a layer of silk outside, otherwise he wouldn't have been knocked unconscious. He was holding the violent weapon and was about to ask who had smashed him just now. A girl ran over and said happily, "Uncle, you're awake. Don't get close to me, I don't know you." Tang Ning waved her hand. "Let me tell you, there are witnesses and physical evidence." "Wait, what did you call me just now?" "Uncle." The girl looked at him and said with a smile, "My uncle took the hydrangea from the young lady. He is the uncle of the Zhou family. We all saw it. In order to prevent the young lady from marrying someone named Dong, the uncle held the hydrangea and died. Don't even let go." "Wait a minute." Tang Ning's mind was a little messed up and he needed to sort it out. "Miss, throw the hydrangea, uncle?" Did he catch the hydrangea thrown by the Miss Zhou family and become the uncle of the Zhou family? But Tang Ning lowered her head and looked at the thing in her hand. "Is this thing a hydrangea? Have you ever stuffed hydrangeas with stones? And is that throwing? That is smashing. What's more, who knows what the Miss Zhou family looks like? If she is a strange woman who weighs more than 200 pounds and is not obviously beautiful, she can't get married, and she only plays this trick of throwing embroidery balls to attract brides. She specializes in deceiving honest people. He is the only one. This physique can't stand it." Tang Ning still thought it was a good deal to let them pay some money. While he was stunned, there was another commotion in the room. A young woman walked in from the outside, walked to the bedside, and said softly, "You can rest in peace and recuperate first, and we can wait until later to talk about getting married." The woman in front of him was very beautiful. She was dressed in ancient costume and had the aura of a traditional Chinese beauty. She was like the beauties in ancient costumes in later movies and TV dramas who came out of the TV and stood in front of him. It even gave him a very strange feeling. Real feeling. However, this has nothing to do with him. It wasn't her who got married to him, but the Miss Zhou family whom he had never met before. No matter how good-looking she was, it didn't matter. They were not relatives. Why should they listen to her? Tang Ning still felt that it would be better for them to pay for it. He spoke again, "Well, you smashed me." The beautiful woman looked at him and asked softly, "Ms. Sir, what do you think?" Tang Ning was a little confused. The gap between reality and his imagination was a bit big. He finally calmed down, looked at the woman, and asked, "Are you, Miss Zhou?" When the kingly woman heard this, her expression was a little confused. You don't know me." It's true that Tang Ning didn't know her. To be honest, he didn't even know himself, let alone Miss Zhou. The woman looked at him, a little confused and a little surprised. "Then, why did you appear under the embroidery building, and why did you hold the hydrangea and not let go?" Of course, Tang Ning had to hold on to the hydrangea and not let go. It was a murder weapon and evidence. If he let go, he wouldn't even be able to eat the steamed stuffed bun stuffed with cabbage in the afternoon. He was still expecting the murderer to pay compensation. As for why he appeared under the embroidery building, how did he know that this ghost place would be smashed by people even if he was walking on the street? He also wanted to ask others. he just slept on the bus, why did he sleep here? Seeing the confused expression on Tang Ning's face, the kingly woman seemed to have thought of something. A trace of panic flashed across her pretty face, and she asked tentatively, do you know your name? Of course I know, Tang Ning hugged the hydrangea and said, my name is. The expression on his face was stunned. He seems to really not know the name of his current body, his identity, and where his home is. If you tell nonsense, will you be regarded as a ghost and be buried alive? Tang Ning scratched her head and looked confused. Me, what is my name? The kingly woman's expression was unbelievable. Among the crowd, the woman in the green dress turned pale instantly. She ran out of the room and said loudly, Doctor, call the doctor quickly. In the room, a white-haired old man stroked his beard and said, Miss Zhong, Miss Tang, this young master must have suffered a severe brain injury, which caused him to lose his memory and forget the past, which is the so-called aphasia. The kingly woman looked confused and a little at a loss. The woman in the green dress beside her hurriedly asked, Doctor, can he still be saved? The old man shook his head and said, I have only seen records about lost soul syndrome in ancient books. This is the first time I have encountered it. I can only help him prescribe some prescriptions to soothe his mind and nourish his energy. I hope it will have some effect. As for when can he remember, maybe tomorrow, maybe forever, it depends on his luck. The woman in the green dress leaned on the chair, her face even paler. Tang Ning sat on the edge of the bed, feeling like she was on a porcelain. This made him feel a little guilty, but he couldn't tell them that he came from another world, but he didn't get God's blessing. He didn't give him the system and the golden finger, and he didn't even give him the memory. In that case, it is not apathy, but apathy. Beside him, a girl of 15 or 16 years old looked at him with sympathetic eyes and said, Uncle, you must have liked the lady very much before. Have you forgotten that when you were on the street, you snatched the hydrangea, hugging you tightly, no matter how hard those people beat you, you won't let go? Someone next to me immediately said, Yes, Uncle, you definitely don't want your young lady to marry that beast named Dong. Uncle, please remember it quickly. Tang Ning was still holding the hydrangea in her arms. Seeing the moved people beside the bed, several girls even shed tears. He wiped his eyes and said it was true. He almost believed it himself. He looked at Miss Zhong. Although she was indeed very beautiful, she was not inferior to the so-called ancient costume goddesses of later generations, and her temperament was even better. If she had such a wife. But he has to find a way to go back. He can't stay here all his life. He hasn't been in love yet, hasn't married a wife yet, and hasn't. It seems like something is not quite right. But that doesn't matter anymore. Tang Ning stood up, walked to Miss Zhong, and said, This girl, I really don't know you. If you hurt me, just pay 10 taels of silver and I'll leave right away. I promise I won't bother you anymore. No, before Miss Zhong could speak, the woman in the green dress beside him stood up and said decisively. She, Tang Yao Yao, is responsible for everything she does. She sewed the stones inside the hydrangea and smashed the hydrangea. The guy in front of her now has amnesia and looks like an idiot. If something happens when he goes out, wouldn't it be her fault? Tang Ning's eyes widened and she thought that although 10 taels of silver was a lot in any dynasty, the silver ingots they just gave to the doctor might have been several taels. Looking at the decoration of this room, he must belong to a wealthy family. He was in such a miserable state, yet he didn't even give him 10 taels of silver? There are all the witnesses and evidence. He hugged the hydrangea in his arms tightly and said solemnly, I tell you, today's matter cannot be solved without 10 taels of silver. If you don't give it to me, go to the county government to complain. Tang Ning noticed that after he said these words, their expressions were a little strange. Could it be that he was scared by himself? Who wants to go to the county government to complain? A deep voice came from outside the door. A middle-aged man walked in from outside, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, "Do you want to complain?" Tang Ning nodded firmly. The middle-aged man looked at him and asked, "What grievances do you have?" Tang Ning asked tentatively, "Who are you?" The middle-aged man said calmly, "I am the magistrate of this county." Unexpectedly, this matter even alerted the county magistrate. Tang Ning still didn't want to make the matter a big deal, so she planned to keep it private with the Zhong family first. He looked at the kingly woman, who looked back at the middle-aged man, shook her head slightly. "Dad." Tang Ning looked at her and then at the man who claimed to be the county magistrate. She opened her mouth and said, "Dad. There's no need to change your mind so early." The middle-aged man glanced at him and waved to the two cotters behind him. "My uncle is injured, take him back to his room to rest first." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 3. The third chapter of the main text of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun is a bloody plot. Tang Ning didn't expect that his cheap father-in-law was actually the county magistrate. Now, no matter whether it was human or material evidence, it was useless. Even though he hadn't figured out where this place was, since ancient times, people have never fought against officials. As a newcomer, he didn't dare to take this risk. Sitting in the room, after calming down, he figured out one thing. He was really too impulsive just now. He really couldn't leave. Let's not talk about the matter of Miss Zhong. In this world, he seemed to have lost his memory. He didn't know who he was, where he lived, what dynasty this was, and where this was. At least, he couldn't leave before figuring out these things. This is the most reliable and safest choice. Son-in-law. A girl came in and put a quilt on the bed. The girl was about 14 or 15 years old, with an oval face and a plain dress. She looked cute. Tang Ning had seen her in the room just now. Girls of this age in the future are probably still in middle school. Tang Ning looked at her, showed a kind smile, and asked, "Little girl, what's your name?" He felt that at this moment, he was like a bad uncle who seduced an ignorant girl. But there was no way. The girl in front of him was the one he could get in touch with the fastest and let him understand the world and the things around him. "Son-in-law, just call me Ching-er," the girl said softly. Tang Ning sat at the square table in the room, waved to her with a smile, and said, "Ching-er, come here, I have some questions to ask you." After a while, the girl stood up and said, "Son-in-law, the young lady has something to do, I'll go over first." Go. Tang Ning nodded. The time was short, and what he learned from Ching-er was very limited, but he at least had a basic understanding of the world he was in. The place he was in now was called Lingzhou City. Lingzhou City was composed of Yong'an County and Yian County. His cheap father-in-law was the magistrate of Yong'an County. Lingzhou was under the jurisdiction of the state of Chen. Tang Ning did not know which state of Chen in history this was. It was estimated that the little maid herself was also ignorant of history. He could learn about it slowly in the future, so there was no need to rush. He learned more about the Zhong family and the matter of Miss Zhong just now from Ching-er. Logically speaking, this cheap father-in-law was the magistrate of a county, a top leader, but Yong'an County was not a remote suburban county, but located in the capital of Lingzhou, and there were a lot of officials such as the Lingzhou governor who could suppress him. This was also the reason why Miss Zhong threw the embroidered ball to find a husband today. The story is actually quite bloody. The son of the governor of Lingzhou fell in love with Miss Zhong. He put pressure on her from all sides, but she was no match for him. The governor was notorious in Lingzhou and was a complete playboy. Miss Zhong would rather throw a ball to find a husband than commit herself to him. However, the governor had already sent people to guard the embroidery building and drove away the onlookers. Only he broke in without knowing the truth, so he appeared here. No wonder those people fought hard to grab his ball today. The peach that he had been guarding for so long was picked by others, and no one would feel comfortable. Such a bloody plot, even the online writer named Rong Xiaorong, who Tang Ning knew was famous for writing bloody plots, would not dare to write it like this. But it happened. There was a sound of footsteps at the door, someone knocked on the door, and then two figures walked in. One was his nominal wife, Zhong Yi, a very nice name. Next to her was a woman in a green dress, who looked about the same age as her, and whose looks were equally beautiful, but whose temperaments were completely different. Zhong Yi was a classical beauty, and she looked gentle and generous, while the woman in the green dress looked a headache. It was a real headache. Just now, I learned from Qing'er that it was her idea to put stones in the hydrangea, and she was the one who smashed the hydrangea herself. If she hadn't smashed it, Tang Ning would probably still be walking on the street in a daze, not knowing who he was, not knowing where he was, like a homeless beggar. Instead of sitting in a spacious and comfortable room like now, with a beautiful wife and a father-in-law who was a county magistrate, so Tang Ning should thank her? Tang Yao Yao. The woman in front of him had a very charming name, and it was also a name that gave Tang Ning a headache so far. Coincidentally, he had the same surname as her. Zhong Yi walked to his side and asked softly, "You, still don't remember anything?" Tang Ning shook his head. A trace of worry appeared on Zhong Yi's face. "Have you even forgotten your name?" Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "There must be a name for me. Just call me Tang Ning. I always feel that this name is inexplicably familiar." Tang Yao Yao gritted her teeth and secretly spit in her heart. Even a random name has to follow her surname. Is he planning to rely on her? Then she was a little disappointed. The trouble was caused by her. At least before his memory is restored, she will be responsible for him to the end. Tang Ning. Zhong Yi repeated the name twice and nodded slightly. Tang Ning looked at her and suddenly asked, "Are there any books here? I want to read some books. Maybe I can recover some memories." Zhong Yi thought for a while and nodded, "Come with me." The Zhong mansion was very large. Zhong Yi led him through 2 long corridors and 3 moon gates before arriving at the door of a room. Tang Ning was very suspicious about how a county magistrate could buy such a large house. In his memory, no matter what dynasty, the salary of a county magistrate did not seem to be very high. Some were so poor that they could not even afford to eat. Could his cheap father-in-law be a corrupt official? Zhong Yi looked at him and said, "This is my study. If you want to read any book, go find it yourself." "Thank you." Tang Ning nodded and walked in. Zhong Yi did not go in with him. The woman in the green dress pulled her away a little, looked at her, and asked, "Are you really going to marry this person of unknown origin?" Zhong Yi smiled slightly and said, "It's better to marry anyone than that person." "No," Tang Yao Yao frowned and looked at her, saying, "You said before that the person you want to marry must be a great talent. This matter was caused by me, and I have the responsibility to help you solve it." Tang Ning could not hear the conversation between the 2 women in the yard. His attention was all on this study. Although the study was not large, it was very delicately decorated. 3 walls were filled with bookshelves. There were various books on the bookshelves, involving classics, poetry, calligraphy, and painting. There was an open book on the table. Tang Ning glanced at it. The handwriting on it was beautiful. It should be the reading notes made by Zhong Yi. Tang Ning did not read it again, nor did he mess with the things on her table. He walked straight to the bookshelf full of history books. He took out a book and opened it. The handwriting was certainly not the simplified Chinese characters he was familiar with, but fortunately it was not some scribbled characters, but a very upright regular script, which meant that the dynasty he traveled through was not too far away, and it was unlikely that he traveled through to some chaotic era. Tang Ning had not systematically learned traditional Chinese characters, but strangely, he had no difficulty reading this book, and he was also very familiar with the fonts in the book. He could only attribute it to some indelible memory in this body, the familiar fonts, the familiar Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, which made him feel more familiar. Spring and Autumn period and Warring States period, Qin and Han dynasty and Three Kingdoms, Wei, Jin and Southern and Northern dynasties, Sui and Tang dynasty, 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, Zhao and Song dynasty. The names of the dynasties were correct, but Tang Ning was a little confused when he looked at the historical events in detail. That's not right, the Qin dynasty actually existed for 50 years, which was several decades longer. He remembered that the Tang dynasty existed for nearly 300 years, but here there were only more than 100 years left. Did the other 150 years go to waste? He was familiar with many of the major historical events recorded in these history books, and even more unfamiliar. Are you sure this is a history book and not a novel? Tang Ning opened the next book with some disbelief. Next, next, next. Next, next, next. It was late at night. Tang Ning was lying on the bed, tossing and turning. He had read history books all day, and had to accept a reality. This was not the world he was familiar with. In the vast history, there were many things he was familiar with, but there were even more things he was not familiar with. If he really had to match them one by one with the history he was familiar with, he would definitely go crazy. Is this an imaginary world or a parallel world? He didn't know. In addition, he also discovered another magical thing. There were some errors in his memory. After crossing over, he did not get the original memory of this body, and his original memory was stripped away. Stripping means that he can easily recall some things, including when he wet the bed when he was 2 years old, fell when he was 3 years old, and was sent to an orphanage when he was 4 years old, including the faces of his deceased parents that had long been blurred and forgotten in his memory. Everything was so clear. He could casually look through his memories of more than 20 years, accurate to the minute and the second, like a bystander. As soon as he thought about it, a clear picture would appear in his mind, absolutely high definition and without code. However, for a hardcore single dog who has been single for 23 years, it doesn't make much difference whether there is a code or not. He lay in bed, flipping through his memories, especially before he was 4 years old, when his parents were still alive. This was what he looked forward to the most and what he lacked the most during the years he stayed in the orphanage. He looked at every frame until his consciousness began to blur. Uncle! Uncle, uncle, get up! Uncle, get up quickly, this morning you and the young lady will go to pay respects to the master and the lady. I don't know when I fell asleep last night. Tang Ning's eyelids felt heavy. Ching Er's crisp voice came to his ears. He turned over and said vaguely, "Don't make trouble, let me sleep a little longer. It will be too late if you don't get up now." "Uncle, uncle." The maid named Ching Er pushed his body, but Tang Ning was unmoved. The little maid ran out with a pout, saying loudly, "Young lady, uncle can't get hard this morning." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 4. Miss, your husband won't get up this morning. Ching Er is at the age when a girl's voice is the sharpest and clearest. Tang Ning felt that her shouts could be heard throughout the Zhong mansion. Tang Ning actually has a good work and rest habit, but he has just arrived in this world and is not so used to everything. He couldn't sleep until the second half of the night yesterday, and couldn't even open his eyes when he got up in the morning. After Ching Er shouted at him a few times, he lost all sleep. He got up quickly, washed up very quickly, and went to meet his nominal father-in-law and mother-in-law with Zhong Yi. He had met his father-in-law yesterday, but it was the first time he met his mother-in-law. Tang Ning actually felt like a new daughter-in-law meeting her parents-in-law. The cheap father-in-law has a dignified face, but the mother-in-law is the opposite, giving people a very gentle feeling. After meeting her, Tang Ning knew where Zhong Yi's temperament came from. As for Zhong Yi, his nominal wife, she was like a pool of clear water, calm and peaceful. She was neither enthusiastic nor too distant to him. Tang Ning didn't care about it. They were people from two different worlds in the true sense. What he was thinking about now was not how to cultivate feelings with her and have a harmonious relationship with her, but how to go back. He began to read all the books he could see, trying to find a clue. He moved a large number of books from Zhong Yi's study every day, returned them the next day, and borrowed new ones by the way. He locked himself in the room, reading all day, and never went out except for eating, sleeping and going to the toilet. So, in the minds of the servants of the Zhong family, the image of this new son-in-law gradually changed from vague to clear. This is a real nerd. They have never seen such a dumb nerd. The young lady is so beautiful, and she is also a famous talent in Lingzhou City. How can she not be more interesting than those piles of books? Tang Yaoyao stood in the yard, looked at the closed door, turned around and asked, "Has he been like this for half a month?" Zhong Yi nodded and said, "He has finished reading all the books in my study." Tang Yaoyao scratched his hair, suddenly looked at Zhong Yi, and lowered his voice, "It should be difficult for a nerd like this to pass the exam. Among the talented people you know, there is no such person." "Yes, it must be." Without waiting for Zhong Yi to answer, Tang Yaoyao comforted herself. Generally speaking, this kind of nerd who only knows how to study hard will not have a good future, and it is not considered that she has delayed him. Comforting herself in this way, she felt better. Qing looked inside the room and said with admiration, "Not really, the son-in-law must have studied so hard in the past. If he hadn't lost his memory, he might have won the top prize in the future." Tang Yaoyao's face turned pale when he heard this, and he felt as if he had been shot in the chest. So, she might have delayed a future top prize? She rubbed her brows and asked, "What else is strange about him these days?" Qing thought for a moment and said, "My uncle sometimes laughs for no apparent reason, sometimes looks sad, and often talks to himself. Oh, he goes out every day and chats with a group of beggars." Tang Yaoyao's face turned pale. It was not only that she had caused him to have amnesia, but he was also insane. Inside the room, Tang Ning stood up and sighed deeply. What sins did he commit in his previous life that God would play such a big joke on him? He just slept on the bus and came here inexplicably. He thought that when he woke up one morning, he would go back inexplicably. Facts proved that he thought too much. In half a month, the last glimmer of hope in his heart was almost exhausted. He was not a person who gave up easily, but facing such a mysterious and strange thing as time travel, he still couldn't avoid despair and powerlessness. Since he was here, he would make the best of it. Maybe there would be some solutions in the future. For now, he could only choose to live well. But the problem came again. He didn't know how to take the imperial examination. He didn't have the capital to do business. Thinking carefully, he didn't seem to have one or two skills that he could show off. After walking out of the gate of Zhong Mansion, it was a problem what to eat for the next meal. It seemed that he could only live a life of idleness here and barely maintain his life. As for the memories of his previous life in his mind, except for turning out a few movies he had seen in his spare time to kill time, it seemed that there was no use. He pushed the door and walked out. It was still some time before lunch. He left Zhong Mansion and walked around the street. It took him half an hour before he returned to Zhong Mansion. Every day, he would go to the alley where he woke up that day, not to find information about his identity, but to find the little beggar. If it weren't for the little beggar, the handful of water, and the bun stuffed with cabbage, he would have traveled through time for the second time. However, he had never seen him again since that day. He asked the beggar in that alley and learned that he didn't come here every day. Lingzhou is very big, and the territorial consciousness among beggars is very serious, but not every beggar has his own territory. Beggars without territory will walk around in Lingzhou. That day was also the first time they saw the little beggar. Tang Ning sighed. Although he only gave him a handful of water and a bun, it was a life-saving grace to him. Ching-er walked out of the room and shouted, "Uncle, it's time to eat." The girl's crisp and beautiful voice, Tang Ning was a little allergic, and he would get goosebumps when he heard it. Zhong's son-in-law is a nerd, and he can't get hard in the morning whenever he thinks of the way the servants in Zhong's house look at him. Tang Ning wants to press Ching-er on the bed and spank her until her butt is swollen. Although he and Zhongyi are nominally married, it is only in name only. Tang Ning has his own small courtyard, and Zhongyi also has his own room. The two have always slept in separate rooms. This further confirms the second guess. Tang Ning knows very well that he is just a shield. The two have not held a wedding, but there is a marriage certificate. His father-in-law is the county magistrate. It only takes 2 sentences to get him an identity certificate in Tang Ning's name and then go to the government office to register for marriage. He has nothing to complain about this. They just get what they need. The Zhong family needs his son-in-law to shut up the governor. He has just come to this world and needs some time to adapt. If it weren't for this cheap father-in-law to help him get some things including identity certificates, he would not be able to survive for 3 days. It can be seen from Zhongyi that the Zhong family has a good upbringing. When eating, they usually don't talk while eating or sleeping. Tang Ning eats silently. When Zhongyi finishes eating, he leaves with her and then goes back to their own rooms. During the meal today, the father-in-law seemed a little absent-minded. He stopped his chopsticks several times when they were about to reach his mouth, and didn't notice that the food on the chopsticks fell off. The woman opposite him couldn't help it and looked at him and asked, "Master, is Governor Dong making things difficult for you again?" Zhong Mingli didn't admit or deny it, and said, "There is a case that is more difficult these 2 days. If it is not handled well, I am afraid that Governor Dong will take the opportunity to make trouble again." As if he thought of something, he suddenly put down his chopsticks, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "The clerk in the yamen is sick and can't come to court tomorrow. If you have nothing to do tomorrow, come and record a case for him." Half a month after arriving at the Zhong mansion, Tang Ning was captured for the first time. A clerk in the yamen was sick, and what Tang Ning had to do was to temporarily take his place when the court was held tomorrow. After dinner, Zhongyi brought some files over and placed them on the table in his room, saying softly, "These are some previous case files. Take a look first and copy them tomorrow." Tang Ning flipped through a file and found that what he had to do was not a technical job. It was just to record some key testimonies and case progress. As long as he could write, there would be no big problem. Fortunately, although he did not inherit the memory of this body, he seemed to be born with the ability to read and write. He could only attribute it to some kind of muscle memory of this body. After putting down the file, Zhongyi did not leave. After thinking for a moment, she looked at him again and said, "Thank you." Tang Ning turned her head and looked at her. "Huh. If it weren't for you, I would have to marry the son of Governor Dong." Zhongyi looked at him, thought for a while, and said, "I'm sorry that you got hurt like this. When you recover your memory, if you want to leave, I will ask Dad to let you go." She left the room after she finished speaking. Tang Ning walked over and closed the door with a smile on her face. "This Miss Zhong is not bad. Yong'an County Government." Bang! Zhong County Magistrate slammed the gavel and shouted, "Open the court." Powerful, powerful. The yamen runners on both sides held water and fire sticks and knocked on the ground quickly and rhythmically. A sense of urgency immediately rose above the lobby. County Magistrate Zhong spoke again, "Bring the prisoner." Tang Ning sat in an inconspicuous corner on the left side of the county hall. He thought that what was played in the TV series was actually true. He never thought that one day, he would sit in the court of ancient trials in such a capacity. The prisoner was brought up soon. Tang Ning's task was to record the trial process. Logically, he should not be distracted. But he was not in a hurry. Although God did not give him a heaven-defying system or golden finger, he was really not stingy to not give him any skills. The changes that happened to him were not just to find a few movies he had seen from his memory to relieve boredom when he was bored. As long as he saw it with his own eyes and heard it with his own ears, he could remember it firmly in his mind. This is not just a photographic memory, this is a human camera. Absolute Dolby surround, high definition and uncensored. In the corner of the court, Tang Ning was thinking about other things. On the main seat in the middle, Zhou Mingli looked dignified. Looking at the kneeling figure below, he asked in a deep voice, "Prisoner Suji, do you know your crime?" Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 5. Although Tang Ning had watched a lot of detective dramas in her previous life, such as Young Bao Qingtian, the judge of the Song dynasty, Detective Direnja, and The Strange Case of Shi Gong, but after personally experiencing the plots in the TV series, this is the first time in my life. This is a human life case. Throughout the ages, cases involving human life have always been serious cases. And in this case, my cheap father-in-law is in trouble. Tang Ning read all the files last night. The case was actually not complicated, nor had it had any twists and turns. The deceased was a member of the Communist Party of China with a small fortune outside the city. He was found dead in his home a month ago. After many days of investigation and visits by the police, the suspect was finally locked on the son-in-law of the deceased Zhao Yuanwei. Zhao Yuanwei has no children, and he and his late wife only have one daughter. If Zhao Yuanwei dies, his family property will naturally be inherited by his daughter and son-in-law. According to common sense, Zhao Yuanwei's son-in-law, a man named Suji, has enough motive to kill. But the problem is that on the night Zhao Yuanwei died, Suji had a perfect alibi. He was drinking with friends that night and didn't go home until very late. After the case was investigated here, according to past practice, Suji only needed to be tortured to extract a confession. With the torture methods of this era, unless he was a very mentally strong person, if Zhao Yuanwei was really the murderer, it would not take long for the criminal to endure it. Constantly confessing. This is where the trouble lies with his cheap father-in-law. Ever since he offended the governor of Lingzhou by marrying his daughter, the governor had regarded him as a thorn in his side and was waiting to catch him. This case occurred in Yong'an County and involved a major human life. The governor strictly ordered the Yong County magistrate to solve the case within a time limit, which is understandable. At the same time, the imperial court has been cracking down on cruel officials in the past 2 years, and has strictly prohibited local county government officials from abusing heavy weapons and beating them into submission. Once discovered, they will not be lenient. Therefore, when serious cases are tried, there will be local people standing outside the court to observe. Once severe punishment is used, in full view of the public, and violates the imperial ban, the Lingzhou governor will have enough reasons to move him. But if there is no need for punishment and no evidence can be found, the prisoner will definitely not be recruited. There is a murder case under his jurisdiction and the murderer has not been caught for a long time. The Lingzhou governor has another reason to touch him. My father-in-law is really a sinner. Tang Ning sighed, silently mourning for his cheap father-in-law, and started writing. In the courtroom, Zhou Mingli's face was extremely gloomy. He looked at the man in the hall and asked, "Suji, you said you were drinking with friends that night. Apart from the two of you, were there any other witnesses that night?" The man knelt in the hall, with a bitter look on his face, and said loudly, "Sir, I was drinking at Wang Er's house that day, and there was no one else around except Wang Er." Zhou Mingli looked at the other person kneeling next to Suji and asked, "Wang Er?" Suji said that on the night of the 15th of last month, the two of you were drinking at your house, and he didn't leave until his wife. Is this true? Without waiting for Wang Er's answer, he raised his voice again and said, you think about it before you decide. In a major human life case, if you shield a criminal, you will be punished as the same crime. Wang Er, who was kneeling on the ground, trembled, glanced at Suji beside him, and said in a trembling voice, Sir, everything I said is true, I hope you will see clearly. Okay, then tell me what kind of wine you drank that day and what kind of food was served with it. The drink is home-brewed rice wine, and the wine is served with 2 tails of pig head meat. In the corner, Tang Ning looked at the 2 people kneeling in the hall and shook her head slightly. He had read all the files all night yesterday. He had asked his father-in-law countless times about this question, but the 2 of them, Su and Wang, had obviously colluded in advance and couldn't get anything out of it. Or maybe Suji was simply wronged. If so, this case would be even more difficult. He put down his pen and rubbed his stomach, feeling a little hungry. This trial lasted for almost an hour, but there was no progress at all on the case, and the meal was already over. It was okay if he didn't rub it, but when he did, his stomach suddenly made a gurgling sound again. The case had already reached a bottleneck. The magistrate's face was as dark as water. Others were also trembling with fear and did not dare to make a sound. The sound of Tang Ning's stomach growling was particularly obvious. Zhou Mingli looked to the corner and met Tang Ning's eyes. Ever since she experienced extreme hunger last time, Tang Ning has become particularly afraid of hunger. He is a little worried that if his father-in-law continues to procrastinate like this, will he miss lunch? The case was once again at a deadlock. Zhou Mingli was already depressed. He didn't know what he had eaten in the morning, and his stomach was filled with turmoil. He looked at Tang Ning and said, I'll be out for a while. I didn't record anything just now. You can do it again now, asked them both. After saying that, he held his stomach and left in a hurry. Tang Ning could replay her memory at any time and didn't have anything to ask, but she still took a pen and paper and walked out of the corner. The government servants standing on both sides looked at Tang Ning, who came out with a strange expression on their faces. They have all heard about this nerdy uncle in Magistrate Zhong's family. Rumors say that he is a rigid person who only knows how to study, locks himself in his room all day long, and turns a blind eye to beauties like Miss Zhong. There are also rumors that the reason why Mr. Zhong's uncle is so cold to Ms. Zhong is because he can't get up in the morning. Tang Ning walked up to Suji with a record book in one hand and a pen in the other. On the 15th day of last month, were you drinking at Wang Er's house? He opened the book and asked. Yes, I drank with Wang Er that night, and then left. Suji nodded. What kind of wine did you drink and what kind of food did you eat? The rice wine I drank was Wang Er's home-brewed rice wine, and what I drank with it was 2 tails of pig head meat. Tang Ning took notes with pen and paper while the government officials around him were bored. They had listened to this question and answer countless times. Tang Ning looked at Suji and continued to ask, is pig head meat delicious? Suji was stunned and nodded again, okay, delicious. Where did you buy it? Tang Ning asked again. Butcher Zheng from East Alley. Does Butcher Zheng sell meat at a fair price? Fair, fair. Has Butcher Zheng ever bullied the market? No, no. Did you know that Butcher Zheng has a nickname called Zheng Guangzai? Have no idea. Does Butcher Zheng know that you killed Yuan Weizhao? I don't know. Suji subconsciously wanted to answer, but unexpectedly broke into a cold sweat and said immediately, Sir, the villain didn't kill anyone. Don't be nervous. Wipe off your sweat first. I'm just asking. Tang Ning smiled and closed the book. He turned around and took 2 steps, then suddenly turned back and asked, by the way, it's the 15th day. When you left Wang Er's house, the moon must be very round and it must be very bright outside, right? Suji just breathed a sigh of relief. He was startled when he heard this, and then nodded immediately. Yes, I remember it very clearly. The moon was very big and round that night, and it was very bright outside. You are lying. Tang Ning's tone suddenly changed. She pointed at him and said sternly, it was obviously cloudy on the 15th day of last month. Where did you see the big, round moon? The young scribe's expression changed from indifferent to stern, and Suji was stunned on the spot. Tang Ning looked at Suji and raised her voice again. Why did you lie? What on earth were you doing that night? Did you kill Zhao Yuan? Why? Suji's body trembled and he broke into a cold sweat again. He quickly changed his words and said, Sir, I remembered it wrong. I was drunk that night and couldn't remember clearly. I just remember now that there was no moon that night. Tang Ning knelt down, looked into his eyes, and said, I was just saying casually, that there was actually a moon that night. Suji trembled, cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and changed his words again, Sir, I was drunk that night, and I don't remember whether there was a moon. The statement is vague, repeated, and hesitant. There must be something to hide. What are you guilty of? Little man has no guilty conscience. If you don't have a guilty conscience, why are you shaking and sweating? Looking at you looking so haggard, you have been dreaming about Zhao Yuanwei a lot these days, right? No, Suji was sweating like rain, his lips were trembling, and he was speechless. Tang Ning's tone suddenly changed and she shouted, Tell me honestly, what on earth were you doing that night? His loud shout even startled the officials in the court. Suji was even more nervous and said in panic, Sir, villain was really at Wang Er's house that night. How dare you quibble? Tang Ning interrupted him and waved her hand violently, I'm not asking about the night you killed Zhao Yuanwei, I'm asking about the night before you killed him. The night before I killed him. What he just said was full of flaws. The young clerk was aggressive. Suji was sweating like rain on his forehead. His heart was almost broken. He was breathing quickly and hurriedly explained. Halfway through his explanation, his body suddenly trembled and his voice stopped abruptly. Zhou Mingli came back from the hut. His body felt refreshed, but his heart was still depressed. If there is no result in this case today, Governor Dong doesn't know how to embarrass him. He sat back down and found that the courtroom was quiet. He looked at Tang Ning below and wondered, why don't you ask? Tang Ning turned around, cupped her hands slightly, and said, Sir, I've finished asking. Wow! As soon as he finished speaking, the originally silent court suddenly erupted into a huge uproar. A government officer looked at the prisoner who was lying limply on the ground, touched his companion with his shoulder, and asked, did he just confess? The companion next to him was still trying to remember whether there was a moon on the night of the 15th day of last month. Hearing this, he asked in confusion, what did you say? The Yamen officer looked at the crowd of people outside who were almost boiling, and knew that he had heard correctly. This case that had been bothering them for nearly a month was just solved in a few words by Uncle Zhou. Is this still the nerdy uncle from the Zhou family? His eyes looked at the young man standing in the hall. All eyes in the hall couldn't help but look over. Tang Ning stood in the hall and let out a long sigh of relief. The case was solved, he should be able to go back to eat, right? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 6. In order to rectify cruel officials and reduce unjust, false, and wrongful convictions, the Imperial Court issued an order not long ago, strictly prohibiting local governments from using severe punishments and beating prisoners into submission. Once discovered, they will be punished severely. However, this is not absolute. If the evidence is conclusive, or the outcome of the case is already very obvious, and the criminal is still unwilling to plead guilty, then the court's ban can be treated as appropriate. Just now, Suji, out of desperation, inadvertently admitted the fact of killing Zhao Yuanwei. The police officers in the court and the people outside the court heard clearly and could not deny it at all. He knew that the matter had been exposed, so he resisted stubbornly at first, but after 2 punishments, he couldn't bear it anymore and resorted to all the punishments. Because he coveted the property of his father-in-law's family, he had the idea of murdering his father-in-law a long time ago. On the night of the full moon last month, he killed his father-in-law Zhao Yuanwei. Before that, he had colluded with his friend Wang Er to make Wang Er perjury in court and create an alibi, causing the case to be deadlocked for a month. In addition, he also confessed to the hiding place of the murder weapon. Based on the clues he confessed, the 2 detectives successfully found the hatchet. At this point, the murder case of Zhao Yuanwei has been completely revealed. The behavior of the new uncle of the Zhong family in court was deeply engraved in the hearts of the county government officials and the people who were watching. The Zhong mansion is right next to the county government office, so the servants of the Zhong family naturally learned the news immediately. The impression of my uncle in their hearts changed for the first time. This is not a nerd who only knows how to study. He solved a case that even his own father couldn't solve in a few words. My uncle is obviously a smart person among smart people, but he just can't get up in the morning. Tang Ning doesn't know these things yet. He only knows that he is still the uncle of the Zhong family in name. The Zhong family's troubles are his troubles. If something happens to his cheap father-in-law, he will not be able to continue to live a stable life. And the most important thing, he was really hungry. He suspected that he was really hungry last time, which caused the feeling of hunger to be magnified countless times in his body every time. He never wanted to experience that feeling of hunger again. Zhong Mingli looked at Tang Ning, who had already eaten 2 bowls of rice and was filling the 3rd bowl. He coughed lightly, added a chicken leg and put it in his bowl, and said, "Eat slowly, if it's not enough, let the kitchen make it again." "That's enough, thank you." Father-in-law Tang Ning was a little flattered. Although he felt that he deserved the extra chicken drumstick, Mr. Zhong, known as the cold noodle king of hell, personally picked up the food for him. In the past half-month, it was the first time he had eaten it. Once. Not only Tang Ning, but also Zhong Yi and the woman sitting on both sides looked at them twice. Zhong Mingli didn't seem to notice anything strange about the 2 of them. He put down the bowl, looked at Tang Ning, and suddenly asked, "On the 15th day of last month, was it sunny or cloudy?" Tang Ning took off the chicken leg from her mouth and said, "I don't know." "Then why did you?" "Nonsense." Tang Ning didn't know whether it was sunny or cloudy on the 15th of last month, but he felt that Suji probably didn't know either. Not only that, Suji probably has not watched The Deadly Grass starring Stephen Chow. Zhong Mingli coughed lightly, looked at him, and said, "Thanks to you today." Tang Ning said modestly, "It should be." The case of Zhao Yuanwei's murder had not yet been concluded. Zhong Mingli left in a hurry after finishing his meal. After Tang Ning finished chewing her share of the chicken drumstick, Zhong Yi stood up with him. As the 2 walked back together, Zhong Yi hesitated several times, but she didn't speak until Tang Ning returned to the room. As soon as she walked to her study, Qing ran over with a happy face. The expression on the little maid's face was full of excitement. She ran to her side and said impatiently, "Miss, my uncle is so powerful. When the master was interrogating the case just now, I was hiding outside and listening, and even the master couldn't do anything. My uncle immediately made the bad guy confess his crime." "Who said that my uncle is a nerd?" Zhong Yi was startled, looked at Qing and said, "Speak slowly, what exactly happened in the court today?" Tang Ning came out of the alley again, but still didn't meet the little beggar. The little beggar who appeared in his world when he was at his most dangerous and helpless and gave him a handful of water and a bun. Due to his life experience, Tang Ning had seen and suffered a lot of evil in his previous life, so he cherished the hard-won kindness even more. It's a pity that the little beggar appeared in his life and pulled him out of the abyss, but never appeared again. This alley was a gathering place for beggars nearby. He stood at the entrance of the alley and sighed leisurely. Behind him, an old beggar leaned against the wall, with several urchins surrounding him. Let me tell you, on the fairy mountain 500 miles away from Lingzhou City, there lives a group of gods. They can fly with swords, call the wind and rain, chase lightning and wind, and are omnipotent. Tang Ning didn't finish her sigh, but held it back. What? Flying with a sword, calling for wind and rain, chasing lightning and wind. There is a fairy mountain 500 miles outside Lingzhou City. I have never heard of it. Could it be that what he traveled through was not the ancient world, but the world of immortals? However, these days, he has almost finished reading the books in Zhongyi's study, and he has not seen any books that say that there is a fairy mountain 500 miles outside Lingzhou City, and there is a group of gods who can call the wind and rain on the fairy mountain. As a young man who has received higher education in the 21st century, he must always bear in mind the core values of socialism. He cannot believe in feudal superstitions. He has traveled through time, so what else can he not believe in? Although the probability is very slim, but what if it happens? That is his chance to go back, the only chance. Tang Ning had almost given up hope of going back these days. At this moment, he was like a drowning man who grabbed the last straw. Of course, he would not be so stupid as to stop anyone on the street and ask if there is a fairy mountain outside Lingzhou City. If there is really no fairy mountain, he will be regarded as a lunatic. For such a question, he can get it out of Ching'er's mouth with a short story. He glanced at the old beggar and walked quickly towards the direction of the Zhong mansion. Beside the old beggar, several children had already heard it with their eyes shining and breathing rapidly. At this moment, the old beggar's voice stopped abruptly, a smile appeared on his face, and he asked, "Do you want to know how to worship under the immortals and learn the immortals' magic?" "Yes," the children said in unison. "If you want, each of you pay 1 penny, and I'll continue." At the Zhong mansion, Tang Yaoyao looked at Zhongyi and couldn't help asking, "Do you think he could be pretending?" She was very interested and enthusiastic in proving that Tang Ning was not really struck by her and had lost his mind, but was pretending to be crazy and stupid. Probably not. Zhongyi shook her head. She actually had doubts about this, but through the contact these days, some of the strange words and strange actions he occasionally said on weekdays had long since made her give up this idea. Tang Yaoyao looked at her and asked, "But today, he is even more." This is exactly what Zhongyi was wondering about. She had already listened to Ching'er's detailed account of what happened in court today. He first used ordinary inquiries to dispel the prisoner's vigilance, and then took him by surprise to make him lose his composure. The final questioning was the finishing touch, making the prisoner fall into his trap without knowing it, and indirectly admitted to the murder. This process, the control of the prisoner's psychology, reached an extremely subtle level. Even her father, who had been the county magistrate for more than 10 years, could not do this, but a person with amnesia. Tang Yaoyao saw her expression and asked expectantly, "How is it, do you also think that he is pretending to be stupid?" Ching'er, who was standing by, thought for a while and said, "Miss Tang, the son-in-law just lost his memory, not stupid. Even if a smart person loses his memory, he is still a smart person." Tang Yaoyao felt that another arrow hit her chest. Tang Ning walked in from outside and saw the 3 people sitting in the yard. She nodded slightly to Zhongyi, then waved to Ching'er and said, "Ching'er, come here, I have something to ask you." Ching'er trotted over, and soon, trotted back. Tang Yaoyao hurriedly asked, "What did he ask you?" Zhongyi also looked at her. My dear, I just asked you if there is a fairy mountain 500 miles away from Lingzhou City, and if there are fairies flying on swords on the mountain. It's over, he not only has amnesia, but also insanity. Tang Yao Yao's face was pale, she covered her chest, and leaned weakly on Zhou Yi's shoulder. Lingzhou City, at the entrance of a lane. Several women picked up their children, and several other men punched and kicked an old beggar leaning against the wall. Old thing, if you cheat children's money again next time, I'll beat you to death. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 7. Tang Ning was disappointed, and his last hope of going back was shattered. What fairy mountains, what gods, what calls the wind and rain, what chases lightning and wind, it's all fake. Feudal superstition is very harmful to people, and even a highly educated man cannot avoid it. Tang Ning was secretly ashamed in her heart. It was a hot day, and Tang Ning was lying on the bed, thinking about this in a daze, her eyelids getting heavy. He had a dream. He dreamed that there was a fairy mountain 500 miles outside Lingzhou City, and there were gods on the mountain who could call the wind and rain. He went through many hardships, worshipped at the mountain gate, learned immortal skills, tore apart time and space, traveled through the future, and finally returned to his original world. Then he somehow saw Qing'er's face. Qing'er shook his shoulders and said hurriedly, "Uncle, uncle, don't sleep." Tang Ning has the habit of taking a nap at noon. Only by taking a nap at noon can she ensure that she has enough energy to deal with the heavy schoolwork. When Qing'er saw that he didn't wake up, she ran outside and said loudly, Miss, Aunt." Tang Ning woke up instantly, jumped out of bed quickly, and covered her mouth from behind. It's shameful enough that he can't get hard in the morning. If the news comes out from Qing'er again that he can't get hard at noon, he will be embarrassed to see anyone in the future. Well. Qing'er covered her mouth with him and could only make a muffled sound. She stared at him innocently with her eyes wide open. After Tang Ning let go of her hand, she took a few deep breaths and said, "Uncle, Miss Tang has hired a miracle doctor. Please go over and have a look." Tang Yao Yao was very concerned about his health. In the past half-month, he invited many doctors to Zhou Mansion to try to cure his lost soul syndrome. Of course, this was just because she felt like she was responsible for her amnesia. In fact, Tang Ning did not starve to death on the street, and she would like to thank this Miss Tang very much. If it weren't for her shocking attack that day, how could he have food and drink every day, a big house to live in, and a beautiful wife? I can only look but cannot move. This made him feel even more like a porcelain dog who repaid kindness with revenge. He decided to have a good talk with her today to dispel her guilt about this matter and prevent her from always asking the doctor to torment him. When he walked into the front hall, Zhou Yi was by Tang Yao Yao's side. Seeing him come in, he walked over and said softly, "Mr. Sun's medical skills are very superb and he is famous throughout Lingzhou. Maybe he will have your condition any solution." Tang Ning knew that she was not sick, but no one believed it except him, unless he could remember his name and where he lived. Tang Ning sat on the chair and stretched out her wrists skillfully. No matter how good the doctor was, he couldn't diagnose him. He had traveled here from another world. The old man with white hair and beard sitting opposite him stretched out 3 fingers and put them on his wrist. He closed his eyes for a long time and then slowly opened his eyes. Tang Yao Yao stood beside him and asked hurriedly, "Dr. Sun, how are you? Is his head broken?" Tang Ning glanced at her. He never liked hearing what this Miss Tang said. Divine Dr. Sun stroked his beard, shook his head and said, "The Yellow Emperor's internal classic says that the heart is the official of the monarch, where the gods come from. All the organs are responsible for life, intelligence and wisdom are all controlled by it." Tang Yao Yao was confused after hearing this, and looked at Zhou Yi for help. Zhou Yi smiled and explained, "What Dr. Sun means is that people's thoughts and memories all come from the heart. My husband's amnesia seems to be a brain injury, but in fact it is an injury to the mind. Tang Yao Yao understood this time, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, so, not only is his head broken, but his heart is also broken. Tang Ning finally understood why some people forced Zhong Yi to marry her, but no one forced her to marry Tang Yao Yao. A strange woman like her, unless someone is blind, will probably not be able to get married in this life. This young master's pulse is stable, calm, and gentle, neither floating nor sinking. He is in very good health. Dr. Sun looked at Tang Ning and said, heart and brain diseases cannot be treated randomly. I will first prescribe him a prescription to calm his mind and strengthen his brain. Let's take it for a few days and see the effects. Ching'er quickly fetched a pen and paper. Dr. Sun dipped his pen in ink, thought for a while, and began to write the prescription. Tang Ning glanced at it and couldn't help but admire it in her heart. Not to mention the medical skills of divine Dr. Sun, his good calligraphy alone was beyond his reach, let alone the ghostly drawings on some prescriptions in later generations. Ginseng, Poria, Scrofulariaceae, Salvia, Platycodon. After seeing the first few medicines written by divine Dr. Sun, Tang Ning seemed familiar with them. Soon he understood where the familiarity came from. The old dean was a Chinese medicine doctor. He had bad eyesight and often asked Tang Ning to help him read medical books. He didn't remember it at the time, and he can't forget it now. Isn't this the Heavenly King's heart-building pill in 1,000 gold prescriptions? A picture quickly emerged in Tang Ning's mind. The Heavenly King's heart-building pill, a tranquilizer, is mainly used to treat restlessness, fatigue, and forgetfulness, neurasthenia, schizophrenia, and wet dreams. This has something to do with his illness, which at least shows that Dr. Sun is not prescribing medicine randomly. After Dr. Sun finished writing the prescription, he handed the piece of paper over and said, remember to boil 3 bowls of water into 1 bowl and take it twice a day. Tang Ning looked at the prescription, then counted the numbers in her head uncertainly, and asked doubtfully, are there 2 herbs missing from this? Divine Dr. Sun looked at him and asked in surprise, Master, do you know where this is? The Heavenly King's heart-building pill. Tang Ning looked at Divine Dr. Sun, even more surprised, and said, the Heavenly King's heart-building pill has a total of 14 flavors, but here there are only 12. Tang Ning began to doubt the medical skills of Dr. Sun. Don't bully me because I haven't been educated. Even if I haven't been educated, I can still count numbers within 20 correctly. Seeing that Tang Ning really said Tian Wang Buletin Xin Dan, Dr. Sun showed a trace of surprise on his face, and then asked in confusion, Tian Wang Buletin Xin Dan has only 12 ingredients in its prescription. Where did you hear the 14 ingredients from? Tang Ning thought for a while and said, Buletin Xin Dan uses cypress and jujube seeds, 2 winters, raw earth and angelica root, 3 ginsengs, platycodon and cinnabar, and polygala and poria to nourish the spirit. Count, how many ingredients are there? Thanks to the old dean, if he hadn't asked him to help look up the book at that time, Tang Ning might have been deceived by a quack doctor today. I wonder if Buletin Xin Dan, which is missing 2 ingredients, can still nourish the heart? The formula for the Buletin Xin Dan. The confusion on Dr. Sun's face immediately turned into shock. He grabbed his hand and asked anxiously, where did you hear this formula? It's written in Tianjin Fang. Tang Ning looked at Dr. Sun with a strange expression and thought, Tianjin Fang is the work of the king of medicine Sun Simiao. He has checked it out. There is also Sun Simiao in this world, who is also known as the king of medicine. His reputation is the same as in another world. Dr. Sun has not even read the book of his own family, the king of medicine? Divine Dr. Sun moved his throat, looked at Tang Ning, and spoke after a long while, the Tianjin Fang written by our ancestors was lost hundreds of years ago. Only the fragments have been handed down. This Tianwangbuxin Dan originally had only 8 herbs. Our ancestors have increased it to 12 herbs after countless experiments over hundreds of years. He murmured to himself, Buxin Dan uses cypress and jujube seeds, 2 winters, raw earth and angelica root, 3 ginseng, platycodon and cinnabar, and polygala and poria to nourish the spirit, yes, yes, 14 herbs, this is the original rhyme of Buxindan. Divine Doctor Sun looked at Tang Ning with great eagerness, and said, since you can tell the rhyme of Buxindan, you must have read the original Qinjin Fang. This is of great significance to our Sun family, to the entire medical field, and to the common people. I hope you can tell me the truth. Tang Ning was stunned. Only the fragments of Qinjin Fang were left, and only 8 of the 14 herbs were left. Has the setting of this world changed? Tang Yao Yao looked at Tang Ning in surprise. Didn't you lose your memory? Yes, I did lose my memory. Tang Ning turned to look at her, wondering, why did you suddenly remember all this? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 8. The atmosphere in the room was a little awkward. Tang Yao Yao looked at him suspiciously. Even Zhong Yi looked at him with a hint of suspicion. As for the look in Dr. Sun's eyes, Tang Ning felt that when he first came to this world, he must have looked like this when he saw that bun. Tang Ning knew that as a person with amnesia, he should not remember the 1,000 gold prescription, let alone discuss with the miracle doctor in front of him whether the heavenly King Buxin pill is a 12 or 14 flavor medicine. The most inappropriate thing is that the heavenly King's heart-building pill is really a 14 flavored medicine. Tang Ning pointed to her head, shook her head, and said, I don't know. When I saw this recipe just now, I suddenly remembered this. Maybe, I have seen it somewhere before. He could only choose to play dumb to the end. Dr. Sun looked at him nervously and asked, little brother, can you really not remember anything else? Tang Ning shook her head. Divine Dr. Sun was silent for a long time, then sighed and said, 1,000 gold prescriptions was written by our ancestors. The original book was lost hundreds of years ago. Now even the Sun family only has a fragmentary copy. I doubt it. My little brother has some connection with our Sun family ancestors. Tang Ning apologized, sorry, I really can't remember anything. As a fool, and as a person with amnesia, Tang Ning could only continue to be confused. There are many lost prescriptions recorded in thousands of gold prescriptions, which are of great significance. Divine Dr. Sun looked at him and said seriously, if my little brother recovers his memory, he must remember to tell me. Tang Ning nodded and said, don't worry, Mr. Sun, if I think of anything again, I will definitely let you know. Tang Yao Yao looked at Divine Dr. Sun and asked, can't even you cure him? Divine Dr. Sun looked at Tang Yao Yao, shook his head and said, human memory and thoughts are extremely mysterious. When he can recover his memory, it only depends on fate. Tang Yao Yao was a little disappointed. Even Divine Dr. Sun was helpless against his apathy. There were not many doctors in the entire Lingzhou city, and even in the entire Chen kingdom, who were more skilled in medical skills than him. And she also remembered what Divine Dr. Sun said just now. The guy who lost her memory after being hit by her was related to the inheritance of medical knowledge and the common people. The more he was related to, the greater her guilt she felt. There was a deep look of remorse on her face. Tang Ning knew that she wanted to cure herself, and didn't care about the curse she had just made on herself. She said, Miss Tang, you don't have to blame yourself. Dr. Sun also said that it depends on good fortune. Maybe one day good fortune will arrive. When you wake up, drink a cup of hot water will make me think of it. Tang Yao Yao was startled, her eyes changed slightly, but she still curled her lips and said, if drinking hot water can cure the disease, what else do you need the doctor to do? That's wrong. Tang Ning shook her head and said, drinking hot water can not only maintain gastrointestinal health, prevent colds, detoxify and nourish the skin, but also improve menstrual pain. In Tang Ning's generation, drinking hot water has become a tradition. Auntie is here. Drink more hot water. If you feel sad, drink more hot water. If you have a headache or a cold, drink more hot water. If you have diarrhea, drink more hot water. No matter where the pain or disease is, it can be solved by just drinking more hot water. Except that it is easy to lose your girlfriend, there is almost nothing wrong with this sentence. He often saw the rhetoric just now in public account articles forwarded in his circle of friends. Divine Doctor Sun nodded and said, "My little brother, what you said makes sense. The Nei Jing says that the decoction is used to cure the disease." Mencius also said. When Tang Yaoyao heard detoxification and nourishing the skin, her heart moved. She didn't hear what was behind it and asked, "What kind of pain can be improved?" "It's nothing." Tang Ning shook her head. "I just said it smoothly, but even in later generations, it is not an issue that can be discussed with girls face to face, let alone now. It would be strange if they are not regarded as hooligans." Dr. Sun said, "My little brother is right. When a woman is pregnant with geranium, it is indeed very beneficial to drink more hot water." Shameless. Tang Yaoyao's face turned blood red, she glared at Tang Ning fiercely, and walked out quickly. Zhongyi blushed, looked at Tang Ning with a look of reproach, and followed her out of the room. Qing'er covered her face and ran out. When she stepped out of the door, she almost tripped over the threshold. Tang Ning looked at the door innocently. Countless ancestors struggled with all kinds of pains and illnesses before summing up the saying, "Drink more hot water." What a valuable experience this is, why don't they know how to cherish it? What's more, Tiankui is what old man Sun said, it has nothing to do with him. Tang Ning turned to look at Divine Doctor Sun, and saw that his hair and beard were all white, his face was pale, and he had an immortal spirit. Even when he said that sentence just now, he seemed to be talking about an ordinary thing, without showing any obscene expression. I am afraid that in his eyes, there is no distinction between men and women, so naturally it cannot be said to be shameless. Outside the courtyard, Tang Yaoyao's face was no longer so red, but he looked distressed and said, "What if he really can't remember what happened before?" Even Divine Doctor Sun asked him for help. As she got to know Tang Ning better, she realized more and more clearly how big a trap she had created. "Don't worry, there must be a way." Zhongyi knew that she was doing it for herself in the first place, but it was useless to worry about it. She changed the subject and said, "Even Divine Doctor Sun just said, drink hot water at that time, it will be better, do you want to try it?" Tang Yaoyao would have a stomachache every time Kuishui visited. Although she wasn't in pain, she still didn't feel good. She also wanted to solve this problem, but when she thought about that guy actually saying such embarrassing things to her, a trace of blush appeared on her face again, and she said angrily, "I don't want to listen to him." Until he returned home and locked himself in his room, the blush on his face had not dissipated. She walked to the table, poured a glass of water, raised it to her mouth, but quickly put it down. She looked outside the door and said, "Shiu'er, please come in." A maid came in from outside and asked, "Miss, what's the matter?" Tang Yaoyao thought for a while and said, "Go and pour me a cup of hot water." Tang Ning was very leisurely, a little unaccustomed to being idle. Perhaps he was used to being busy in the past, with studies, life, and work. In his previous life, he seemed to have never been idle. And in this strange world, he really didn't know what to do. There is no need to think about studies, there is no need to work at all, and there is no need to do anything in life, including food, drink, and housing. How do you feel like you are being taken care of? He was so free that he squatted in the yard and watched the ants move. The bright sunshine suddenly disappeared, and her eyes became a little dark. Tang Ning raised her head and saw two long legs. Tang Ning conservatively estimated that Tang Yaoyao was at least 1.75 meters tall, with a tall and slender figure. Because of her flat chest, it felt like her legs were all from the neck down. If she were 10 centimeters taller, Tang Ning would have to look up to her. Tang Yaoyao handed him a book and said, Divine Doctor Sun asked me to give it to you. You should read it first and see if you can recall anything. Tang Ning stood up and took the broken copy of 1,000 gold prescriptions from her hand. Even though she knew it wouldn't remind him of anything, she still opened it in front of Tang Yao Yao. Tang Yao Yao looked at her and asked expectantly, "How is it? Did you remember anything?" Tang Ning shook her head. Tang Yao Yao had a look of disappointment on her face. She suddenly looked at Tang Ning and said, "How about I hit you again? Maybe if I hit you again, you will remember." Tang Ning's face turned dark. Looking at Tang Yao Yao, who was eager to try, he quickly said, "Miss Tang, thank you for your kindness. I don't blame you for the amnesia. You must not worry about it again in the future. No, this girl dares to do things responsibly. Don't worry, I will be responsible for you to the end." As she spoke, she suddenly covered her lower abdomen, and a trace of pain appeared between her eyebrows. She couldn't help but bend down and asked, "Do you have hot water here?" Tang Ning looked at her with a strange expression and nodded, "Yes." Since he came to this world, he has developed the habit of not drinking anything other than hot water. The worst he can do is boil water and let it cool down. With today's medical level, if he gets diarrhea or is infected with some germs due to drinking raw water, he was afraid that he wouldn't even have a chance to travel through time for a second time. He quickly walked out of the room, holding a cup of hot water in his hand, and handed it to Tang Yao Yao. After Tang Yao Yao frowned and drank the water, she held her lower abdomen, but the pain between her brows did not diminish. Tang Ning looked at her, thought for a moment, and said, "Actually, drinking hot water has limited effect, and drinking too much will not help. You can't touch cold water at this time. Keeping warm is very important. You should find a hot water bladder." Tang Ning pointed to her lower abdomen and said, "Putting it here will help relieve pain." "Really?" Tang Yao Yao looked at him suspiciously. "Just try and you will find out." "Who wants to try?" Tang Yao Yao looked at Tang Ning and saw that he was still pointing at her belly. Her face turned red. She looked at him and said in embarrassment, "Shameless." Tang Ning watched her swaying her long legs away in confusion. After a long time, she twitched her lips and said, "Ah, woman." Tang Mansion. The maid named Xiu'er walked into the room, looked at Tang Yao Yao lying on the bed, and said, "Miss, I brought the hot water bag you asked for. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 9. That Divine Doctor Sun's medical skills might be really high, because after knowing that even Divine Doctor Sun was helpless to deal with his amnesia, Tang Yao Yao did not invite any other doctors. This allowed Tang Ning to finally have a few days of peace. Tang Ning had discovered a long time ago that Tang Yao Yao was a good-natured girl. Apart from being a bit reckless, unable to speak, and flat-chested, she was still kind-hearted and had an enigmatic sense of responsibility. Her shortcomings are obvious, as are her strengths. Her legs are very long. Men of later generations would often use the sentence when describing beautiful women: fair skin, beautiful appearance, and long legs. For many people, their love for long legs is more than fair skin and good looks. Of course, Tang Ning is not a leg control person. He just feels that Tang Yao Yao's legs are very long and can give people a strong sense of beauty without wearing high heels. Although he has not personally measured it, his intuitive feeling tells that his and her figure should be very close to the golden ratio. Tang Ning came back from outside again, but there was still no news about the little beggar. If he hadn't confirmed it from the beggars' mouths, he would have even suspected that he was hallucinating because he was on the verge of starving to death. He returned to Zhone Mansion and passed through a moon door. When he was about to go back to his room, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him. Tang Ning didn't have time to stop and she ran straight into him. Ouch! Tang Yao Yao covered her nose with tears streaming down her face. She glared at him with wide eyes and said, "Why are you leaving in such a hurry? What are you doing here?" Tang Ning rubbed her chin and asked in surprise. He was just thinking about the little beggar when Tang Yao Yao suddenly jumped out from behind the moon gate, which startled him. Naturally, Tang Yao Yao would not tell him. She had checked medical books and it said that people suffering from aphasia might recover their memories when they were frightened, so she wanted to try a few more times. Unexpectedly, not only did he not scare him, but he hit her nose, causing her to shed tears of pain. Tang Yao Yao rubbed her straight nose, waved her hand and said, "Forget it, I don't care about the faults of others, and I won't argue with you." Tang Ning shook her head, returned to her room, and took out a book she hadn't finished reading yesterday to kill time. Tang Yao Yao did not go to Zhongyi this time, but sat opposite him and suddenly said, "Let me tell you a story." Tang Ning put down the book to see what other ideas she had come up with. No matter what, it's better to listen to her tell stories than to be startled by her suddenly jumping out from behind. Tang Yao Yao looked at him, took a deep breath, and said slowly, "Once upon a time, there was a scholar. On his way to Beijing to take the exam, he met a woman. They got along day and night and developed feelings. However, the scholar didn't know that that woman is actually a fox demon." She looked a little pale and looked at Tang Ning. Seeing his calm expression, she said in a trembling voice, "Aren't you afraid?" "Afraid?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked in surprise, "Are you telling a ghost story?" He thought Tang Yao Yao was telling some erotic story about a scholar and a fox demon. Are there any ghost stories like this? Scholar and fox demon, this is the standard combination of erotic jokes. Listen first. Tang Yao Yao glared at him, grabbed the hem of his skirt with both hands under the table, and said, "Whenever the scholar stays up late to read, the woman will stand behind him and hold his shoulders." When Tang Yao Yao said this, her face became paler and her voice trembled a little, but the scholar doesn't know that the person behind him every night, slapping his back and squeezing his shoulders, is actually a standing fox. Zhongyi walked in from outside, patted Tang Yao Yao's shoulder from behind, and said doubtfully, "Yao." "Ah." She only said the word Yao, and Tang Yao Yao immediately shouted and jumped up from his position. Before Tang Ning could react, she threw her to the ground. Tang Yao Yao closed her eyes and looked pale. She waved her hand and shouted, "Fox, don't come here, don't come here." At the table, Zhongyi looked at the two of them with a look of astonishment. On the ground, Tang Yao Yao threw herself into Tang Ning's arms, closing her eyes, waving her hands messily, and shouting loudly. Tang Ning had a dark face and pushed her shoulder. Tang Ning patted the dust on her clothes and looked at Tang Yao Yao with a strange look. To be honest, this was the first time in his 2 lifetimes that he saw someone who told ghost stories to scare him. In the room, Tang Yao Yao looked at Zhongyi with some resentment and said, "Why don't you even make a sound when you walk?" Zhongyi blinked and looked at her innocently. "Okay, okay, I don't blame you." Tang Yao Yao waved her hands in frustration. She should read the almanac when she went out today. She originally wanted to tell him a ghost story to scare him and see if it could make him think of something. But it was herself who was frightened. This was the second time she had been embarrassed today. Zhongyi came over to ask Tang Ning to eat. When the 3 of them walked out of the yard, they saw Zhong Mingli leaving in a hurry. Tang Ning knew that her father-in-law, the county magistrate, was very busy. He was often too busy to have time to eat at home, and he was still not here today. Tang Yao Yao was left to have dinner with her mother-in-law. Without Zhong Mingli around, the atmosphere at the dinner table became much livelier. Of course, most of the time, Tang Yao Yao talked to his mother-in-law, and he and Zhongyi listened. It can be seen from this that Zhongyi is introverted and Tang Yao Yao is extroverted. She can make her mother-in-law smile with just 2 or 3 sentences. If any man masters her skills, There is no way in the world. There is no such thing as a mother-in-law. Chen Yuxian looked at Tang Yaoyao and said, Yaoyao, you must remember what your aunt said. If you want to find a husband in the future, you must find someone from the Gu family. Otherwise, it will be difficult for the whole family to have a meal together. Tang Yaoyao took a bite of vegetables into her bowl and said with a smile, Aunt Zhong, Uncle Zhong is the magistrate of the county. He has to take all the big and small things in Yong'an County into consideration, so he will naturally be much busier than others. But if you want to say that Uncle Zhong doesn't care about his family, I'm afraid that Uncle Zhong will die of injustice. If it's not really urgent, he won't be in a hurry to go home for dinner. Chen Yuxian was happy when he heard this, but did not show it on his face. He said, what's the benefit of being a county magistrate? The murder case a few days ago was finally solved. What evil spirits are haunting Qiajia village outside the city? We invited Fang Wei, the old god is going to catch ghosts. Why is he going to join in the fun? Fang Wei immortal, catching ghosts. Tang Ning raised her head, with a shocked expression on her face, and asked in surprise, what kind of immortal is this? Tang Ning needs to review. He had just sworn a few days ago that he would never believe in ghosts and gods again, but today, he still wanted to see what the old god looked like. After eating, he went straight out of Zhong mansion. After walking a few steps, he turned his head, looked at Tang Yaoyao who was following him, and asked, why are you following me? Tang Yaoyao glanced at him and said, who is following you? Does this road belong to your home? I can go wherever I want. Tang Ning shook her head and continued walking forward. Do you think there are really ghosts in this world? Tang Ning took 2 steps and heard another voice from behind. Tang Ning turned around, looked at Tang Yaoyao who looked timid, and said with some humor, if you are afraid, just stay at home. Am I afraid? Tang Yaoyao looked at him with wide eyes and said disdainfully, my martial arts skills are very powerful. If there really is a ghost, I will punch each one. Her expression at the moment was a little cute. Tang Ning couldn't bear to expose her. A vixen scared her like that. How could she pretend to be a martial arts master? He smiled and turned away again. Seeing Tang Ning turn around and leave, Tang Yaoyao felt itchy with hatred. This guy, she cared so much about him and didn't take him with her to watch the fun. He'd better make sure not to ask her for anything in the future. Tang Ning walked a few steps, then suddenly turned around, thought for a moment, looked at her and asked, how to get to Qiajiakan? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 10. Tang Ning originally didn't want to take Tang Yaoyao there, because apart from her long legs, her other strengths were not obvious, and she also liked to scare herself. He also had to be on guard at all times to see if she would hit him on the head again while he wasn't paying attention. Based on his understanding of Tang Yaoyao, she could do such a thing. But if he didn't take her with him, he wouldn't know where Qiajiakan was. Although he could ask anyone at random, he wouldn't say whether it was reliable or not. It would be troublesome and time-consuming to find. If the old god ran away, where would he find him? So Tang Ning could only reluctantly bring her along. Fortunately, her legs were long and her steps were long, so she wouldn't be a drag on him. The two of them walked out of the city gate. Tang Yaoyao turned to look at him and asked, hey, haven't you remembered your name yet? Tang Ning shook her head. Tang Yaoyao asked in confusion, Uncle Zhong asked the households to check. There is no one named Tang Ning in Yong'an County. There are no villages or big households named Tang around Lingzhou City. Is your name just a lie? Tang Ning looked at her and asked, isn't your family considered a wealthy family? Tang Yaoyao glanced at him and asked, we are the only Tang family in Lingzhou City. Could it be that you are our Tang family? Tang Ning stopped dwelling on this issue and changed the subject, what happened in Qiajiakan? It seems that all the county police officers were dispatched. Tang Yaoyao knew more than him. After Tang Ning listened, she probably knew what happened. Kuajia village is a village under the jurisdiction of Yong'an County. Since yesterday, many people in the village have suffered from vomiting and diarrhea. Because there are too many people sick, Zhou Mingli, as the county magistrate, must pay attention. This is not like the murder case a few days ago. If the murderer cannot be caught, it is at best an oversight by the county magistrate, which will harm his political performance. Villagers in half the village fell ill at the same time. Once the disease was not controlled well, the scope of the disease would expand again. This was called a plague in ancient times. If a plague breaks out in Yong'an County, the governor of Lingzhou may be able to withstand the pressure, but his father-in-law will definitely not be able to keep his official title. However, from Tang Yaoyao's description, the villagers in Kuajia village should be suffering from food poisoning or contaminated water sources, causing diarrhea or dysentery. It does not look like a large-scale plague, but even so, they cannot be taken lightly. When Tang Ning and Tang Yaoyao arrived at Kuajia village, Zhou Mingli and the county government officers were stopped at the entrance of the village by the villagers of Kuajia village. Also stopped along with them was Dr. Sun, whom Tang Ning had met. An old man wearing coarse clothes with white hair and beard looked at Zhou Mingli and said, "Master Zhou, it's not that I won't let you in, it's just that the old god is catching ghosts and exorcising evil spirits inside. You all go in. If you disturb the old god, if the evil thing is released, what will happen to our village?" Zhou Mingli pointed to Dr. Sun next to him and said, "Guo Kunzen, this is the famous Dr. Sunday. He can tell what diseases the villagers are suffering from at a glance." The old man hesitated a little, thinking that even though there was only one word difference between a miracle doctor and an immortal, their abilities were far different. He shook his head and said, "Then we have to wait until the old immortal catches the evil thing." Tang Ning stood not far away and watched, gaining a deeper understanding of the system of this era. In ancient times, there was actually a high degree of local autonomy. Villages were often united by clans, and the clan head even controlled the power of life and death of the clan members. Although my father-in-law was nominally the county magistrate, he often did not speak for himself. 100% effective. Zhou Mingli thought for a while and said, "In that case, I also want to see how the old immortal catches ghosts and exorcises evil spirits." The Muramasa looked at him and said, "You can't all go in, or you will disturb the old god." Zhou Mingli nodded, turned around and saw Tang Ning and Tang Yaoyao. His expression changed slightly and he asked, "Why are you here?" Tang Yaoyao thought for a moment and said, "Aunt Zhou asked us to ask, do you want to go home for dinner this afternoon?" "Eat." Zhou Mingli replied, looking away from the two of them, pointing at a policeman and a clerk, and said, "Peng Chen, Secretary Qin, you come in with me, the others are waiting outside." Then, he looked at Tang Ning and Tang Yaoyao and said, "You guys can come in too." An open space was cleared at the entrance of Kuajiakan. An altar was set up in the open space, and the villagers gathered around the altar. In front of the altar, an old Taoist priest with white beard and white eyebrows, holding a mahogany sword in his hand, holding a yellow talisman paper on the tip of the sword, walking with strange steps, there are words in his mouth. With just one glance, Tang Ning knew that his visit today was in vain when he saw this familiar posture that he had seen countless times in movies and TV series. Tang Yaoyao looked at the front with interest and said in surprise, "So this is how to catch ghosts." The sick villagers were placed in the open space next to them, and a little Taoist priest walked among them and sprinkled water from a porcelain bottle on their heads. Dr. Sun walked over, knelt down, took the pulses of several people, looked at the tongue coating, and then stood up with a slightly gloomy look on his face. Zhou Mingli asked hurriedly, "How is it?" Dr. Sun said in a deep voice, "Nausea and vomiting, frequent abdominal pain, red tongue, yellow and dry tongue coating, slippery and rapid pulse." Zhou Mingli said in surprise, What does this mean? Dysentery, Tang Ning said. The onset is sudden, strong fever, thirst, headache and irritability, nausea and vomiting, frequent bowel movements, bright purple pus and blood under the dysentery, severe abdominal pain, and even coma and convulsions, red tongue, yellow tongue coating, slippery or weak pulse, epidemic poisonous dysentery. He had to speak. Dysentery was a disease with a high mortality rate in ancient times. Basically, prevention could only be given priority to with treatment. If Zhou Mingli could not pay enough attention to it, once the disease spreads and cannot be controlled, he, the county magistrate, would once this was done, Tang Ning's peaceful life would be over. Divine Doctor Sun looked at him, nodded and said, "Little brother is right." Zhou Mingli glanced at Tang Ning in surprise. Tang Yao Yao grabbed his arm and asked expectantly, "Have you remembered it again?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "That's all I can think of for the moment." Zhou Mingli temporarily looked away from Tang Ning, looked at Dr. Sun, and asked, "Is it serious?" Dr. Sun looked serious and said, "There is no need to delay." Zhou Mingli's heart suddenly sank. He looked at the old immortal who was still exorcising evil spirits over there, and then at the enthusiastic villagers around him, and said helplessly, "It's not possible now." On the other side, Tang Yao Yao looked at Tang Ning in surprise and asked, "Did you remember anything else?" Tang Ning shook her head. Tang Yao Yao was a little happy and said, "It's okay, I can remember a little bit every day like this, and one day I will remember everything." As soon as she finished speaking, in front of the altar, the old Taoist priest who was walking with strange steps stopped and said loudly, "The power of the 8 directions makes me natural, and the Lingbao talisman tells the 9 heavens, Gen Luidana, Donggang Taishian, kills demons and binds evil, saves thousands of people. Hey, you evildoer, why don't you show your true form soon?" Tang Yao Yao was startled by the sudden sound, but she saw the old Taoist put a piece of white paper on the fire and gently roasted it. On the white paper, a ferocious ghost head actually appeared. The onlookers couldn't help but take a few steps back, with a look of horror on their faces. Even Zhou Mingli and Divine Doctor Sun's expressions couldn't help but change. They looked at the ghost head on the white paper, and their hearts were filled with turmoil. That old Taoist really used an ordinary piece of white paper to make the evil spirit appear? Ah! Tang Yao Yao couldn't help but let out an exclamation, hid behind Tang Ning, grabbed his arm tightly, and said in a trembling voice, "Ghost, there is a ghost." "What a ghost you are!" Tang Ning's arm was so painful from her scratching that she couldn't help but hit her on the head and said, "Why don't you just draw on a blank piece of paper? I'll teach you when I get back." You can also catch ghosts. Tang Yao Yao didn't care about what he had just hit her on the head. She raised her head and asked in extreme shock. Tang Ning curled her lips and said, "That's right, I am the 38th generation descendant of the mission section. Catching a few brats is nothing. Use vinegar to write on white paper. After it is dried, it will appear again after being roasted. This is a science experiment done in elementary school." Tang Yao Yao stared at him and said suspiciously, "Can't you remember who you are?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked doubtfully, "Did I just say something?" The old Taoist priest placed the white paper with the ghost's head on the table and was very satisfied with everyone's performance. He looked around and said, "I have cast a spell to seal the evil spirit on the white paper. Thank you, old god. Thank you, old god." The villagers in Kuajia village looked pious and bowed their heads. At this time, the old Taoist suddenly sighed and said, "It's a pity that my cultivation is limited, but I don't have the magic power to subdue another evil spirit." When the villagers of Kuajia village heard this, their faces turned pale again. The old man Muramis's expression changed. He stepped forward, stuffed a bag into the old man's hand, and begged, "Old god, this is our little respect, please, please save us." The old Taoist weighed the bag, shook his head, and said, "It's not that I won't help you, it's just that my power is limited. Old Muramasa stuffed another bag into his hand. The old Taoist hesitated for a moment and said, "The magic power is." Another bag was thrust into his hand. Seeing that Muramasa could no longer take out the bags, the old Taoist waved his sleeves and the bags disappeared into his sleeves. There was a look of righteousness on his face, and he said, "In this case, even if I waste all my mana, I have to do justice for heaven again." He looked around the crowd again, picked up another piece of white paper, and said, "I am about to cast a spell to kill the evil again. Is there anyone willing to hold this white paper so that I can seal that evil in?" When the surrounding villagers heard this, they immediately took a step back. The veteran's eyes looked at the young man and woman. When the first evil appeared just now, everyone showed expressions of shock and fear. Only the man and woman were not afraid, but were still flirting. He looked at the woman, he smiled and asked, "I wonder if this girl would be willing to do it for me." Tang Yao Yao's face turned pale and she hurriedly took 2 steps back. The old Taoist looked at the young man next to her and asked, "Where is this young master?" Tang Ning was stunned, then pointed at her nose and asked uncertainly, "Me?" A smile appeared on the old Taoist's face, "It's you." The second time to exorcise evil spirits, not using his disciples, but using the hands of this young man, which can completely dispel everyone's doubts. Tang Ning looked at him and smiled, "Okay.